Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I know we've got people on the call from all over the world, so I appreciate you joining. If the timing is not exactly right, we try to do a morning and an afternoon session to accommodate as many time zones as we can. My name is Joy Allen. I'm the Customer Success Manager out of the Michigan office, and we have with us today Kyle Kuntz, who is going to be helping us with host resolution. So this session will be recorded. I will send it out tomorrow after both sessions today are completed. And with that, Kyle, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Joy. Can everyone hear me loud and clear?
I gotcha.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Bill. Saw the hand there. All right, so excuse me. Today I want to talk about device resolution. So keep in mind, I built this out as a level 101. Wanted to make sure we spend a little time going over the concept of what device resolution is, what it actually brings to the table. Just see here, my slide deck's not moving. All right, so want to spend a little time talking about what it is, why you should take the time to go through and do this, or if you should, right? What you can do to basically take a look at how many devices you have identified in your environment today, and how to kind of refine that a little further and see what's actually missing. And then we're going to take a look at some different methods for identifying and resolving any of these unknown devices, and then we'll take a look at some next steps. So this should probably only take about 20, maybe 25 minutes. I made sure to leave some time for questions. So if anyone has questions as we work through this, feel free to just shoot them over in chat. I'll take a look at this every so often, make sure we get these addressed before the call is up. And if there's any extra questions, of course, you can always shoot them to me after. So with that being said, what is device resolution, right? So this used to formerly be known as host resolution. However, with more recent versions, we've renamed it device resolution because it's really a method of resolving or identifying some different devices in your environment that we have not been able to identify through traditional routes such as a data source. So first example is physical hosts. Physical hosts are one of those tricky things where, typically we can identify IP addresses if there is one and they happen to be connected through NFS, or we can see HBAs if they're using fiber channel. So it's usually really hard for us to actually determine which host is which. So device resolution will show you some methods to go through and identify these physical hosts. Also storage arrays. So if any of you have storage arrays that there's currently not a data source for, but you need to be able to identify this to see where it sits in your environment, what's happening, resource correlation. We need to make sure and resolve those storage arrays. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then tapes and switches. Okay, so switches are kind of the same thing there. There's not a data source. We need to use device resolution to be able to identify these. All right, so why should we take the time to go through and identify these? Is it really worth the time? So recommendation is it's absolutely worth your time. Okay? It's necessary for you to accurately track your performance and your inventory in your environment. So there's quite a few devices in most people's environments that can't be discovered via data sources, such as those physical hosts, as we discussed. So this is really the only way to track this data around these devices. If you don't go through and identify these, you basically can run into some issues. So first, this is incomplete paths. So let's talk about those physical hosts as an example again. If you have this physical host, let's say you have an HBA hooked up and you have 2 to 4 ports coming in for multipathing. So as far as OCI is concerned, it sees those worldwide nodes. Because it sees just the worldwide nodes, we don't really know if they all sit on one host, if they're all an individual host. So by not identifying that physical host, we don't really know what's happening with these paths. We also are unaware if there's multipath connections in the environment. If we've taken the time to go through and build out all of our applications, but we haven't went through and identified physical hosts, then We don't have the ability to go through and group those applications per host when we're building out widgets for dashboards or when we're running, executive level reporting. So it's very, very important there. The topology views. Topology views add a lot of value for OCI. You guys have that ability to go in and see your environment end to end, what's connected to what and where. And by not taking the time to resolve devices, we lose that full topology. So I'll show you guys some examples here to look at. And then for those of you that are relying on OCI for accurate data warehouse reports, and excuse me, there is a typo here. That's supposed to be data warehouse and reporting. But we may have inaccurate data by not resolving devices. So it's very, very important that we take the time to go through and do this. Let's take a look at an example here. So this is looking at your FC Identify. We'll talk a little bit more about the difference between FC and IP and kind of dive into that. But for now, let's focus on the differences between a device that we've taken the time to go through and identify versus the ones that are unknown currently. So if we look down here, over on the right-hand side, you guys see the cursor, you're going to see the status. So these are all showing as unidentified. Just grabbed a bunch here as an example. We currently really don't know what these devices are. Okay, we can see a worldwide node. This is pretty much what Insight sees in the ports. Get a little bit of information, such as some of these are being called out as an initiator, but aside from that, there's literally no information. We have no way of diving into these to see what they are. If you guys happen to have, say, like a spreadsheet, you might be able to go over and reference that worldwide node name and figure out what this device is, but this is typically a pretty complex process, or at the very least, time-consuming. So let's say, for example, we went through and did identify this device. So up here, we can see the status on the right is OK. And because we've identified this, you can see we get quite a bit more information. First and foremost, we know this is a host. We know exactly what type of device it is. We also have a name for this host. So we've got a good idea of what we're looking at here. But I think most importantly, we now have a hyperlink that actually takes us over to the host landing page. So this gives us a lot of good information. This is looking at that host landing page. Now, some of you are probably familiar with this. You've either gone through and taken the time to identify hosts already, or you may have added a data source for, say, VMware and have virtual hosts. You're going to see the same sort of information. So now that we've identified this physical host, we have all the applications that are tied to this host, as well as any sort of annotations that we want to include here. Okay, we have all of the resources that are contributing to the host performance. So I think this is really important when you guys are using on-command Insight to go out and track down performance issues, figure out what's happening and what's causing the issue. Resource correlation can really help you nail that down. And now we have a way to tie that into the physical host itself in case that physical host, say, is experiencing some performance issues alone and it's not necessarily tied to any other host or applications. Now we have the ability to see that through the host landing page. Okay. We also have that full topology view I mentioned. So if you go, if I step back and we come over here and click on this see topology, now we have that end-to-end visibility. Right? A lot of you are looking for that end-to-end visibility with on-command Insight. So take the time to identify these devices, then we get that full topology view, including any multipathing. So before I go any further, does anyone have any questions? Feel free to take yourself off mute. Okay. So question I usually have is, how many of these devices do I have in my environment, right? How many unidentified devices do I have that could potentially be impacting me? What am I missing? So recommendation is start with going through and reviewing both of your FC Identify and your IP Identify tabs. So let's talk a little bit about the differences here. So your FC Identify, this essentially contains a list of all of your worldwide nodes and the port info for any fiber channel device in your environment that it can see. So keep in mind we have to be able to see it. It has to be plugged into a fabric that we're connected to. But aside from that, we can see all the worldwide nodes that are connected in. So from there, if we want to see what we have not added in or identified, I'm going to use the filter. I'll show you guys an example. Basically, I'm going to put unidentified in that filter to clear out all those resolved devices. That way I can see what is missing. And then, honestly, I like to add in a little bit more information so that I've got an idea of what I'm looking at. So I'll show you this, but vendor is first and foremost. It's basically going to use that worldwide node name and whoever it's registered under to pull up this vendor and tell you, all right, this might be an HP device. This might be a SolidFire device, a Pure device, whatever it is, right? And then I would also add in the aliases. So every organization is going to be different. Some organizations are going to use a combination of aliases. Some are going to use one and include, host names, storage names, zones, whatever it is. So my recommendation is, depending on which alias you use, let's include that because it can contain some good information. So I'll show you that as well. Now, on the IP identify side, this is a little different. This contains a list of all the devices that are accessing CIFS or NFS shares or iSCSI nodes. So any IP device in the environment. Again, I want to go through and find what's missing, so I'm going to put unidentified in my filter to pull out all the resolved devices, get a good idea of what's left in the environment that I don't have this additional visibility on. And then if I want to, I can refine it a little bit further, and I'll add IQN into the filter. That way I can go from identifying everything, including all the shares, down to specifically those iSCSI nodes that haven't been identified. So let's take a look at this. Excuse me. All right, so what we're looking at right now is the FC identify. First thing to notice here is if you look at the top right, in this environment here, this is one of our NetApp IT environments, we've actually got less than 40% of our fiber channel devices identified, so this is really bad. In a perfect world, we'd want to have 100% coverage on FC and IP identify. However, this is not a perfect world. That's usually pretty hard to achieve. So ideally, we want to see this number as high as possible. Really, we should be shooting to be above 90% in production environments. There may be cases where there's a reason why you're lower, but I would say get this number as high as you can. Talk a little bit more about how. Okay. When I mentioned digging in a little bit deeper and seeing what's actually missing in your environment, this is how we're going to do so. So if you look up here, I've basically typed unidentified and cleared out any of the resolved devices. So next, I'm going to click in this little box up here in the top right, drop down, and we're going to add in some additional columns. So back to the conversation on aliases. If you guys have taken the time to build out an alias that includes the host name, the storage, the zone, and its information, this is what we're actually going to extract that host name out of. So I like to dig a little deeper and see where this information is. So I'll usually add in storage alias, switch, and zone. And then, as I mentioned, I usually like to look at the vendor as well. It gives me a much better idea of what's out there, helps me track down what that device is. So once I've added these all in, it's going to change the view quite a bit. You'll see now we have these additional columns, okay, very valuable. So in a case like this, you can see the vendor's Emulex. So odds are these are HBAs. HBAs likely plugged into a host somewhere. And really, the place we're going to try and gather this information is in this zone alias. You can see we've taken the time to build this out. The host name is in there, buried in the middle. So we are going to use some different methods to actually extract that host name out of that alias. If you guys have not taken the time, if you do not have your host name in any of these aliases, then things are going to be a little bit more difficult, and you might have to take a different method. So we'll talk about the options available. On the IP identify side of things, very straightforward. Again, we can look up at the top right and see this environment's looking pretty good. Around 86% of the IP devices have been identified. And I can refine it a little bit further. Now I can see all my unidentified devices. You can see down here there's about 1,000 of them in this environment currently. We've got the address, we've got the share name, and if we want to find those that are using iSCSI, then I just add IQN into the filter, and now we can see all the iSCSI nodes that are currently unidentified, or I should say devices connected to these iSCSI nodes that are unidentified. Any questions so far? Okay, so how do we resolve these? This is the most important part, right? We've gone through, we've got an idea of what's missing in our environment. Now we need to get these things identified, resolved, so we have that end-to-end view. So you're going to see it's a very different process depending on if we're using FC identify or IP identify. So whether we're trying to find those fiber channel devices or IP devices. So on the fiber channel identify side of things, we've got a couple options. We can use our auto resolution rules, which we highly recommend. We can use manual identification, which can be kind of painful, but it's very, very useful for, you know, those remaining devices after we've used our resolution rules. And we also have the ability to do a CSV import, so I'll show you a little bit more about that. On the IP identify side of things, it's really easy. We have an auto resolution of IPs. Basically, you'll see this is a box we check, and it's going to automatically resolve devices such as those connecting to iSCSI initiators or accessing NFS shares. Okay, so the thing to note here, that auto resolution is not going to be able to identify devices connecting in through CIF shares. So on the NFS side, it's going to be using those NFS exports to identify those devices. So keep that in mind. It's also going to be using DNS lookup to identify these. So I'll show you a little bit more on that. On the IP identify side of things, we also have the option of manually identifying any device and using the CSV import for, I'd say, manually identifying a large number of devices. So let's start out with taking a look at FC Identify. First thing we talked about was creating a host resolution rule. So the goal of a host resolution rule is simply to extract the device name from aliases. So whether that's zone, storage, switch, or if you happen to be using SRM, the idea here is to extract the device name so we can give it a name and tie it into its appropriate resources. So the things that you need to keep in mind before you do this is what type of device you're looking to identify. So are we trying to identify a host, physical host, or a tape library? Going to look different, so we want to make sure we know which is which. Ahead of time, we want to have an idea of what our aliases look like. Did we include that host name in the SRM, in the storage, in the switch, or the zone? Whichever one you know it's in, let's make sure we utilize that so we can extract out of that particular alias. And then we've got to pick a method of extraction. So you guys can take advantage of regular expressions, which we recommend first and foremost because it's just a bit more powerful. You can do a little bit more with it, I think. This is really a conversation on its own as far as learning how to build out regular expressions. Another option here is delimiters. They're pretty straightforward. You can take advantage of those. Or if you're using SRM software, you can use an as-is extraction, which is essentially I plug in the name of the SRM and it's going to just pull that right out. So let's look at this. All right, so what we're looking at here is our auto resolution rules. Right? What you'll see is all of the existing rules. At the top here, we've got our host rules. You'll see we've got two different ones in this environment currently. We can see some good information. We'll actually dive into these. Down below, we've got the tape rules, which we currently don't have any. So if we want to dive into these rule details, let's just come over here, click on the actual rule itself, and we get quite a bit of information. So you'll see in this particular rule, and I'm not going to spend too much time going through the actual regular expressions. As I mentioned, that's really a conversation for itself that we will be having. But for now, you can see there's a lot of information. So there's 7 different regular expressions. So think of these as 7 different steps in this rule it's going to go through to extract this information from devices. And if we look at the top here, we get a good bit of information on what we're extracting. So currently it looks like we're extracting host names. We are using zone alias to extract this out of. We are using regular expressions, as you see below, and we are using DNS lookup. A manual identification, this looks a little different. So essentially we come back over to our FC Identify tab. We want to locate the device, so just highlight it. You'll see over on the right-hand side there's a little pop-up. So you can go ahead and click this pop-up and pick the device type, and then essentially plug in the IP and name and hit save. And that will go through and actually identify that device. So as you can see, this is not something you want to be doing regularly. Not something you want to do to identify your entire environment, right? We want to save this for any of those devices that our auto-resolution rules were not able to capture. Another thing to note here is if we are trying to identify storage that we were not able to identify through data sources, you'll note that this is really the best way to do it, because we can come in here and choose storage. So same sort of thing, you just choose storage as the device type, plug in the IP and name, and hit save. Okay, we can also do manual identification from a CSV. So this is really the same thing as the manual identification we just covered, except for this is going to be for many different devices. So for those of you that may have a spreadsheet out there showing your devices associated with the worldwide node, name, and IP, this might be a perfect method for you. If you do not have that spreadsheet, it's honestly more painful to go out and try and build one of those than it would be to spend the time building your auto-resolution rules. So if you have that spreadsheet, it is very straightforward. We essentially come up here to this Identify drop-down box, choose Identify from File. Apologies, this is coming up kind of poor resolution here. But once you click that Identify from File, just point it to the CSV, and it will go ahead and import that information in. Over on the IP Identify side of things, so start with your auto-resolution of IPs. This is very easy. Essentially, we just check this box down here at the bottom. Once we've checked this box, it's going to use DNS lookup to go out and identify these devices on the IP side. So make sure you have all of your domain names added in here, because we do need to use DNS lookup for this auto-resolution of IPs. So this is why I say IP identification is typically much easier. For all of you on the phone, make sure you have this box checked in your environment today. It's not going to hurt anything, and it may go out and very quickly identify a handful or more of devices that you're showing as unidentified or unresolved today. Okay, one other note here. This is just kind of a separate conversation, but while we're looking at this screen, make sure your auto-resolution schedule, I would change this from manual to every so often. Make sure you set it up as automatic. That way, if there's any changes in your environment, this auto-resolution of IPs or our host resolution rules are going to be able to capture those changes. That way, if devices move around in the environment or we bring new ones in, they're going to get pulled in immediately versus someone sitting down and manually going through this process every time that happens, if they're even aware that it's happening. Okay. Most importantly here, as you know within OCI, don't forget to hit save. Okay, if you go through and set this up. All right, so the manual identification on these is about the exact same as you see with the IP Identify. We can come over and click on the right-hand side, plug in the name and IP, We can also come up here, do the identification from a CSV by dropping that box down and identifying from a file. All right, so with all that being said, I want to take a moment and talk about next month. So our newsletter will be going out next week, and we will have a webinar on regular expressions. So I wanted to include these in the presentation today, but to be honest, they're going to take up at least 30 minutes alone going through this. So I've reserved this for a separate webinar. We will be going over it next month, so keep an eye out next week. You'll see that come your way. And please take the time to hop on and learn how to take this a step further and build out these regular expressions. Okay. We'll go through some examples as well, quite a few different examples. So ideally, by the end of that webinar, between this one and that one, you guys will be able to go sit down in your environment and start identifying or resolving devices that you haven't been able to do so until today. So with that being said, are there any questions? I know I've only got about a couple minutes left. Feel free to take yourself off mute. I think everyone is still on mute. So do not see any questions in chat.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Nice job. I do see a question coming in through chat from Ingo. What about networks and subnets?
All right, so that's a great question. Let me jump back to this IP identify. So on your IP identify, the auto resolution of IPs, it's worth noting that it is only able to identify devices with a unique one-to-one share to device ratio. So subnets are a problem on auto resolution because if you essentially have that share exported out to a subnet, we're not going to be able to identify that. Unfortunately, OCI doesn't take the time to go through each of those IPs within the subnet to figure out what's on that backend and identify it. It's working strictly off that NFS export list. So if you're exporting out to subnets, you're not going to be able to capture that. It is only going to capture those one-to-one relationships. Now, you still have the ability to go in and manually identify those, and you can still use that CSV import if you have a spreadsheet around that you've gone through and built out devices with IPs. But the auto resolution will not capture those shares that are shared out to exports. Does that answer that question for you okay? All right, so I got another one here. How can I ignore devices by vendor like IBM? So what you're going to see, if you guys give me a minute, I may actually have to pull up a live lab real quick. So basically, there is a way to ignore devices. What you're going to see is under our FC identify and our IP identify, below what we're looking at now, there's an extra section. So I didn't include this in here, but that is a great question. If we ever have devices that we want to ignore or vendors we want to ignore, say they're in our environment, but for whatever reason, we do not want to be pulling this information into on-command insight, all we have to do is go down in this bottom section. So what you're going to see is a huge list of vendors. There's a lot of different vendors in there. So there's a filter box. Go ahead and type in, so let's say your question was a vendor like IBM. We want to get rid of IBM. We just don't want to see them. We don't care about them. So we'll go filter by IBM, and then there's simply the option of clicking to include or exclude that vendor, or identify vendor as only tape. So there's also that option. I can go ahead and build out a quick how-to on that. Joy will make sure and get me that, whoever sent that question over to me, so I can get it to you guys. Any other questions?
We are at the end of our allotted time here, so I do want to be sensitive of that. If there are any last-minute questions, you can type them up now. But I just want to thank you for spending your time with us today. This is going to be repeated at 2 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time. And it has been recorded, so I will send this out tomorrow. If there is ever a session that you can't join, I do have recordings for each session. I send it out to those who are registered. So as long as you register, even if you miss a session, you will receive the recording. And it's also at the very bottom of our monthly newsletter. We do the previous month's recordings at the bottom. There's a section for that. So thank you very much. I see Ingo has one more question here. VLANs, how to handle duplicate IPs?
So that's a great question. I'd say get in touch with me directly, and let's get that question taken care of. Either shoot me an email or give me a call, and we'll get that taken care of. I'm not sure who sent that over, so if you could capture that information, Joy.
I will, and it was Ingo. I'll send it to you, Kyle.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Ingo. I'll follow up with you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Will the recording session be sent out to the mails?
Yes, I believe so.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep. We'll be sending the recording out as well as the PowerPoint. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Because missed out a few screens, so want to get them. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We'll send it out to everyone on the line.
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Thank you, Kyle.
No problem. Thank you, guys. We do appreciate you guys hopping on, and I hope to see you guys on our next webinar. Thanks, Joy.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle.